For 20 years, Frank Morrison kept Elizabeth Taylor's darkest secret. Then on his deathbed in 1997, he finally spoke. What he revealed destroyed everything the world thought it knew about her. Frank Morrison was dying, and he knew it. The lung cancer that had been eating away at his body for months had finally won, and the doctors at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center had given him less than a week to live. As he lay in his hospital bed on March 15, 1997, connected to machines that beeped steadily in the sterile silence, Frank made a decision that would shake Hollywood to its core. He was going to tell the truth about Elizabeth Taylor. All of it. For 20 years, Frank had been Elizabeth's personal bodyguard, her shadow, her protector against the dangers that came with being the most famous woman in the world. He had seen everything, knew everything, kept every secret. But there was one secret so devastating, so dangerous, that he had sworn he would take it to his grave. Now, with death approaching, Frank Morrison decided that some truths were too important to die with. The reporter who received Frank's call that cold March morning was James Patterson from the Los Angeles Times. Patterson had covered Hollywood for 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for what Frank Morrison was about to reveal about America's most beloved movie star. "I need to tell someone before I die," Frank whispered into the phone, his voice barely audible from the cancer ravaging his throat. "About Elizabeth. About what really happened during those years. The world needs to know the truth." Patterson arrived at the hospital within an hour, carrying a tape recorder and a notepad, expecting perhaps a few interesting anecdotes about Elizabeth's private life. What he got instead was a confession that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Frank Morrison began his story on a cold November night in 1976, when he first started working for Elizabeth Taylor. She was at the peak of her fame but also at the lowest point of her personal life. Her marriage to Richard Burton had ended in a second, even more devastating divorce, and she was struggling with prescription drug dependency that threatened to destroy her career. "People thought I was just muscle," Frank said, his eyes staring at the ceiling as he spoke. "Someone to keep the photographers away, to handle the fans. But Elizabeth didn't hire me for that. She hired me because she was terrified of someone specific. Someone who had been threatening her for months. But the real shock was just beginning." Frank reached into his bedside table with trembling hands and pulled out a manila envelope, yellowed with age and worn from years of handling. Inside were documents, photographs, and letters that painted a picture of Elizabeth Taylor that the world had never seen. "The threat started in 1975, Frank continued, his voice growing stronger as he delved into the memories he had kept locked away for so long. Not the usual fan mail or celebrity stalking. These were different. They came from someone who knew things about Elizabeth that no one should have known. Private things. Family things. Things that could destroy her if they became public." Patterson leaned forward, his tape recorder capturing every word as Frank opened the envelope and spread its contents across the hospital bed. There were dozens of letters, all typed on the same letterhead, all bearing the same signature that made Patterson's blood run cold. The letters were signed by Dr. Samuel Hoffman, Elizabeth's personal physician from 1973 to 1975. The same doctor who had treated her for various ailments, who had prescribed the medications she struggled with, who had been trusted with her most intimate medical secrets. But Dr. Hoffman hadn't just been treating Elizabeth Taylor. He had been blackmailing her. "She never told anyone," Frank said, his eyes filling with tears for the first time during their conversation. "Not her family, not her friends, not her lawyers. She was too ashamed, too scared of what people would think if they knew the truth about what Dr. Hoffman had discovered during her treatments." Frank handed Patterson one of the letters, dated March 12, 1975. As Patterson read the typewritten words, he felt sick to his stomach. The letter detailed medical information about Elizabeth that was so personal, so damaging, that its release would have ended her career and destroyed her reputation forever. Dr. Hoffman had discovered something during Elizabeth's medical treatments in 1974, something she had hidden from everyone including her closest friends and family. And he was using that knowledge to extort money from her, demanding increasingly large payments to keep her secret safe. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Elizabeth wasn't the only one, Frank whispered, his voice barely audible now. Dr. Hoffman had a whole operation. He was treating dozens of Hollywood stars, documenting their private medical information, and then using it to blackmail them. Elizabeth was just his biggest target because she had the most to lose. Frank pulled out another document from the envelope, this one a handwritten list in Dr. Hoffman's careful script. The list contained the names of over 30 Hollywood celebrities, all former patients of Dr. Hoffman, all victims of his blackmail scheme. The names read like a who's who of 1970s Hollywood, actors, directors, producers, all paying thousands of dollars to keep their medical secrets private. Elizabeth was paying him $50,000 a month, Frank revealed, the number hanging in the air like a physical weight. For 2 years, she gave him over $1 million to keep quiet about what he knew. It nearly bankrupted her. That's why she took so many movies during that period, even the bad ones. She needed the money to pay him off. Patterson was struggling to process what he was hearing. One of Hollywood's most respected physicians had been running a systematic blackmail operation, using his patients' trust and vulnerability to extort money from them. And Elizabeth Taylor had been his primary victim. But Frank Morrison wasn't finished with his revelations. In 1976, Dr. Hoffman got greedy, Frank continued, his breathing becoming more labored as the cancer took its toll. He decided that $50,000 a month wasn't enough. He wanted more. So he made Elizabeth an offer she couldn't refuse. Frank reached into the envelope one more time and pulled out a contract, legal documents that outlined an arrangement so twisted, so manipulative, that Patterson had to read it twice to believe what he was seeing. Dr. Hoffman had demanded that Elizabeth Taylor sign over the rights to her entire medical history to him. Not just the information he already possessed, but everything, past, present, and future. He wanted to own her medical identity completely, giving him the legal right to release any information about her health, her treatments, her private struggles whenever he chose. She signed it, Frank said, his voice filled with the pain of watching someone he cared about be destroyed by someone they trusted. She had no choice. He had too much on her, and she was too scared of what would happen if the truth came out. But the contract included another provision that revealed the true depth of Dr. Hoffman's manipulation. Elizabeth wasn't just signing over her medical records, she was agreeing to continue seeing him as her physician for the rest of her life, ensuring that he would have ongoing access to new information he could use against her. That's when she hired me, Frank explained. Not to protect her from fans or photographers, but to protect her from Dr. Hoffman. She was terrified of him, terrified of what he might do if she tried to break free from his control. For the next year, Frank Morrison became Elizabeth Taylor's shield against her tormentor. He accompanied her to every medical appointment, stood guard outside Dr. Hoffman's office, and did everything he could to protect her from further manipulation. But Dr. Hoffman was smart, careful, and always stayed just within the bounds of legal behavior. He would call her at all hours of the night, Frank remembered. Sometimes he wouldn't say anything, just breathe into the phone for a few minutes before hanging up. Other times he would leave medical supplies at her house, pills, syringes, things that reminded her that he controlled her health and her secrets. The psychological torture continued for months until Elizabeth finally reached her breaking point. On September 23, 1977, she called Frank in the middle of the night, sobbing and incoherent, begging him to come to her house immediately. When Frank arrived, he found Elizabeth in her bathroom, sitting on the floor with a bottle of pills in her hand and a letter from Dr. Hoffman spread out beside her. The letter contained his latest demand. He wanted Elizabeth to publicly endorse a new medication he was developing, using her celebrity status to promote a drug that hadn't been properly tested. She was ready to end it all rather than become his puppet, Frank said, tears streaming down his face as he remembered that terrible night. She would rather die than let him use her name to potentially harm other people with an unsafe medication. Frank convinced Elizabeth to put down the pills and helped her through the crisis, but he knew something had to be done about Dr. Hoffman. The blackmail had gone too far, and Elizabeth's life was now in danger from the very person who was supposed to be protecting her health. What Frank Morrison did next would remain his secret for 20 years, a decision that saved Elizabeth Taylor's life but haunted his conscience until his dying day. "I couldn't go to the police," Frank explained. Dr. Hoffman had covered his tracks too well, and Elizabeth was too ashamed to testify about what he had been doing to her. The legal system would have destroyed her reputation while doing nothing to stop him. So Frank Morrison took justice into his own hands. On October 15, 1977, Frank paid a visit to Dr. Hoffman's private office after hours. He brought with him a briefcase containing photocopies of all the blackmail letters, the contract Elizabeth had been forced to sign, and the list of other victims. But he also brought something else, evidence of Dr. Hoffman's illegal drug experiments, his falsified medical records, and his unlicensed pharmaceutical operations. "I gave him a choice," Frank said, his voice taking on a harder edge as he remembered the confrontation. He could destroy everything he had on Elizabeth and his other victims, shut down his blackmail operation, and leave California forever. Or I could take what I knew about his illegal activities to the FBI. Dr. Hoffman, faced with evidence that could land him in federal prison for decades, chose self-preservation over continued extortion. Within a week, he had shredded all his blackmail materials, closed his practice, and disappeared from Los Angeles forever. Elizabeth never knew exactly what happened, Frank revealed. "I told her that Dr. Hoffman had agreed to stop bothering her, but I never explained how I convinced him. She was just grateful to be free from his control." But Frank Morrison's confession wasn't over. There was one more secret, one final revelation that would change everything people thought they knew about Elizabeth Taylor's later years. The medication dependency that everyone talked about, the health problems that plagued her for the rest of her life, Frank said, his voice barely a whisper now. Most of that was caused by Dr. Hoffman. He had been giving her experimental drugs, using her as a test subject for medications that were never approved for human use. Frank pulled out the final document from his envelope, Dr. Hoffman's private medical notes about Elizabeth, written in a clinical style that revealed the true extent of his manipulation. The notes detailed how he had deliberately created her dependency on certain medications, how he had used her trust to experiment with dangerous drug combinations, and how he had documented her reactions for his own research purposes. "She was never supposed to become addicted," Frank explained. Dr. Hoffman created her dependency deliberately, both to control her and to study the effects of his experimental treatments. Elizabeth Taylor wasn't just a blackmail victim, she was a human test subject. The medical notes revealed that Dr. Hoffman had been conducting unauthorized pharmaceutical research using his celebrity patients as unwitting test subjects. He had used Elizabeth's fame and trust to experiment with drug combinations that would have been illegal in any legitimate medical trial. Everything people criticized her for later in life, the weight gain, the slurred speech, the erratic behavior, most of that was caused by the damage Dr. Hoffman did to her system during those 2 years, Frank said. She spent the rest of her life dealing with the consequences of his illegal experiments. As Frank Morrison's confession drew to a close, Patterson realized he was sitting on one of the biggest medical scandals in Hollywood history. A trusted physician had systematically abused his position to blackmail and experiment on some of the most famous people in America, and the evidence had been hidden for 20 years. "Why are you telling me this now?" Patterson asked. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Frank looked directly at Patterson for the first time during their conversation, his eyes filled with 2 decades of guilt and regret. "Because Elizabeth made me promise never to tell anyone while she was alive. She was too ashamed of what had happened, too afraid that people would judge her for being a victim. But she's gone now, and the truth needs to come out." Elizabeth Taylor had died just 2 years earlier, in 1995, taking her secrets with her to the grave. But Frank Morrison, the man who had protected her from her tormentor, couldn't take those secrets to his own grave. The world needed to know that Elizabeth Taylor hadn't been weak or self-destructive. She had been the victim of one of the most systematic cases of medical abuse and psychological manipulation in Hollywood history. Dr. Hoffman disappeared in 1977, but he might still be alive, Frank said. And there might be other victims out there, people who are still carrying the shame of what he did to them. They need to know they weren't alone, and they need to know it wasn't their fault. Frank Morrison died 3 days after giving his confession to James Patterson. The story was never published. Patterson felt that the evidence, while compelling, couldn't be independently verified, and the potential legal ramifications were too dangerous for the newspaper to handle. But Frank's revelation changed everything Patterson thought he knew about Elizabeth Taylor. The woman the world had judged for her struggles with medication, her erratic behavior, and her tumultuous personal life had actually been fighting a secret battle against someone who had systematically destroyed her health and manipulated her trust. The greatest tragedy wasn't just what Dr. Hoffman had done to Elizabeth Taylor. It was that she had spent the last 20 years of her life believing that her struggles were her own fault, never knowing that she had been the victim of deliberate medical sabotage. Frank Morrison's deathbed confession revealed that Elizabeth Taylor's greatest enemy hadn't been the press, her failed marriages, or her own weaknesses. It had been the man she trusted to heal her, who instead chose to destroy her for his own profit and twisted research. The truth about Elizabeth Taylor's suffering had finally been told, even if the world would never hear it.